Hello, I'm Dr. Tusif Javed, working as a research associate at the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research, Islamabad. The center is a policy institute that projects academically grounded strategic foresight on the issues of importance to civil society actors, policymakers, and state officials. With the changing political landscape at an international level, there's a lot of debate continuing on the importance of voices, stakes, and countries other than Western centric. To discuss the relevance of Asia and the global order, we are glad to have Mr. Einar Tangen today with us. He is a senior fellow from Taihe Institute, Beijing. He's an expert on international relations, global order, and politics. Sir, I welcome you in the program.
Pleasure to be here, Javed.
First of all, I would like to begin by asking this question. What are three broad political undercurrents that are paving the way in Asia?
Well, I think first and foremost is a divide between the global South and Central Asia and the traditional Western powers. If you want to simplify it, it's basically the G7 plus their acolytes, whether it's Japan, South Korea, or otherwise. And that kind of intolerance for past actions and attitudes with kind of this post-colonial, post-World War II environment has collapsed. Second, you have a real change in the economics that is happening, which is part of the exacerbation. You have the West, which has struggling with inflation and a number of other issues, dissension internally, et cetera. But economically, what you're seeing is that these large developed economies are no longer as competitive as they once were. Both inflation and competition are being hit by the fact that they have so much, I would say, wage inflation or wage levels. The United States, the average monthly wage for a person is 8 times what it is in China. China is 4 times what it would be in Vietnam and other places in Asia. So you have this disparity. The U.S. has not responded to it. They basically have taken the attitude that they need to cripple the competition, what I call the Tonya Harding defense, the Olympic who decided to break the kneecaps of her competitor rather than try to take her chances in the arena. That is not working out. There is a brief flurry of activity that's being pushed by huge stimulus that was passed during the COVID period, and also from these subsidies that the U.S. is putting in this effort to quote onshore businesses. But as we can see very clearly with the chip situation, they're not competitive already. TSMC, the huge Taiwanese conglomerate that produces these chips, has said that the same chip made in the United States will cost 30% more than the same chip made in Taiwan. Obviously, that is not globally competitive. With the U.S. government and military may well decide that they wish to have those chips, but they're basically passing that cost on to who else? The taxpayers. So you have the economic changes that are out there. You have these geopolitical shifts. If there's a third issue, it is really about ideology. The U.S. Is convinced that there is only one appropriate way to govern liberal democratic capitalism, despite the disarray in which the U.S. is in and the deep divisions within. Right now, they're unable to even work the system because they have not figured out how to elect a Speaker of the House. They still say that this is the only model that's available. China represents an existential threat to the U.S. simply because it has succeeded with a system that is different from what the U.S. believes. This is absolutely essential to the American psyche, this idea that everything that the U.S. has done, wars, etc., assassinations, interferences in the policies and politics of other countries, is justified under American exceptionalism, that somehow, in order to create the perfect omelet, eggs must be broken, and therefore everything that the U.S. has done is justified. If it came down to understanding that what the U.S. has done was self-interested and was simply, colonialism in a different form, it would be very hard to look back at history and see everything that the U.S. has done. So at this point, you have, as I said, a shift in the global politics away from colonialism, a shift in terms of the economics, and a shift in terms of ideology.
Okay, Mr. Tangen, as the prevailing conversation, as you talked about, mostly focused on Asia as a large market, is Asia's relevance simply important via an economic lens, or other aspects such as culture, values, political standards have the power to influence others?
Well, obviously, China's success has influenced others. And over the last 10 years, China is revisiting its accomplishments under the Belt and Road Initiative, which has brought hundreds of thousands of jobs, lifted people out of poverty, and increased the capacity of especially developing countries to do trade by putting in infrastructure that is necessary. China's example of starting basically with nothing 45 years ago and today emerging as a second world power is it's a much better and more accessible story than saying that somebody wants to emulate the United States or Europe. So yes, China represents a number of fronts of what you're talking about. One, culturally, the Chinese methodology is more about consultation and also consensus building. You've seen that in the way that they manage, whether it's the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, how they approach RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, how they are involved in the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, how they go about being involved in BRICS, and now BRICS Plus. So from China's perspective, the only way that you can achieve harmony in a world which has so many different systems is not to insist on conformity, but to have an understanding that, in fact, countries, cultures, political systems, literature, philosophy, everything is different. And you have to respect that the things that are important are common aspirations. And those would be, everyone wants to be secure in their country. Everyone wants to have development and have a better life. And lastly, every country is a sovereign nation and wishes to have its policies made in its capital by its people, even if it's somewhat flawed, rather than in the capital of some other nation who believes that they know best. If everything had worked out, if the U.S. model had been effective over the last 45 years, we would see peace, we would see prosperity, we'd see a better and safer world. But the fact is, we don't. So I think it's time for people to consider that there are many ways and many paths for different countries to go about achieving what they want. In terms of other cultural and ideological components, yes, communism looms large, but communism today, as practiced in China, is about a government apparatus that is centralized around one party and about the ability to design, plan, and implement policies that are necessary for the nation. This model does not fit every country, nor should it. It is simply what China has done. And as I said, it represents a different path. So, I mean, culturally, things are changing. No longer are people content with the idea that Washington should dictate exactly what should happen. The days of Francis Fukuyama and his idea of the end of history and the last man standing, that there can be only one type of government and economic system, I think those days have passed, and we need to start confronting the reality of a multipolar world where peoples and countries have to be cognizant and accepting of each other, not unlike the Treaty of Westphalia, the treaty that ended the war between Catholics and Protestants, based on the idea that they had very, very different ideas about religion, but that they would practice those within their borders rather than trying to export them to other places.
Okay, after discussing broad political undercurrents and Asia as a cultural aspect referring to China, and you have mentioned the Francis Fukuyama's End of History, how do you want to map Asia? As a unified economic force or as a patchwork of competing influences for big powers?
Well, I don't see it as competing big powers, except when it comes to India. India has a sense that it is somehow batting on par with China at one time. Not so long ago in the 70s, India was slightly ahead or even with China in terms of GDP. But today they're dwarfed. It's about 1/5 the size of China's GDP. They have a different system. It's obviously, it can be variously described, but it's unique to India. And it's an area where China says, well, that's India's internal affairs. They have to sort that out. But from India's, many people in India's government see it as a competition, that they're somehow rubbing elbows up against each other, that China's interfering within areas of its traditional influence, whether that be Sri Lanka, Nepal, etc. Those countries are kind of squeezed in between. But for the rest of Asia, if you start looking at ASEAN and other places, it's really about economics. Today, we're facing really difficult times economically, and there has to be some way of sorting that out. Trade has lifted all boats, not to the same degree, but don't be fooled by this notion that somehow Europe and America lost. The people who lost were the people, ordinary people, whose wages were too high for them to be competitive. Quite frankly, during this, since 2001 and China's entrance into the WTO, 2/3 of all the profits went where? To the developed nations, the G7. They were the ones who soaked up all of these things. So there was an inordinate amount of benefit to those people in the C-suite without much regard to what was happening down below in their countries. This was a failure not of the system, but simply of government. The government needed to start training their people to be ready for the next economy rather than waiting around hoping that somehow jobs would return when it wasn't even economically feasible. So in terms of Asia, Asia is, along with the global South and also the stands, comprises around 160 countries. This is the great movement that is happening that people need to pay attention to, because BRICS Plus represents the beginnings of a cognizance that these 160 countries control the markets, land, the vast majority of markets, land, population, GDP, and production, as well as resources. And if instead of trying to beg from the established powers for them to make good on all the broken promises that they've made, for instance, $100 billion a year in climate aid that has never materialized, or only 10% has materialized. And that 10%, a lot of it is questionable, seems to be traced back to companies that wanted cheap financing from, guess where, the developed countries. So if they want to chart a new course and to deal effectively with climate change, infrastructure development, the economic development and social development of their own countries, they're probably going to have to band together the same way that the OPEC did, and start pricing their commodities at a level where they can, in fact, do these things themselves rather than relying on the kind of charity. Beginning to see that in areas in Central Africa, Malawi, etc., 5 countries who just simply said enough. We have gold, we have minerals, oil, diamonds, everything, but yet we have nothing to eat. So there is a sea change going on in terms of Asia's presence in it. Asia is one part of the global South. And rather than seeing this as exclusive to Asia, I would see it really as post-colonial kind of pendulum swing as countries decide that they need to do for themselves as opposed to relying on the charity of those who've been unreliable.
Okay, Mr. Tangen, historically speaking, Asia was a significant driving factor in the global economy. Western economies dominated in the 19th century as a result of Industrial Revolution. By keeping in context Asian growing economies and youthful demographics, do you think the phrase Asian century is accurate? How would you like to respond to it?
Well, we already have an Asian century. If you've been plotting the wealth line, which traces how much the median wealth that is going on in the country, it's been moving steadily eastwards for the last 30 years. This is not a new trend. What is new is China's dominance in terms of being a production center for the world, ASEAN rising up. I don't actually put a lot of faith in this idea that it's somehow, a wheel that turns and the power that was out suddenly comes back in because of historical or cultural significance. I think in almost all cases, power is taken, not given. And China learned this early on. They did draw on the historical understanding, and they knew that if they wanted to get ahead, and no one was going to treat them charitably, that they would have to do what was necessary. China achieved what it has today because of hard work and planning. The ability to act, to plan and act and execute has been, the magic which is behind this kind of economic miracle, which has lifted so many of its people out of poverty, which has provided a fulcrum for the economies of Asia and increasingly Africa, South America, Central Asia, and has impacted, the developed economies who increasingly are less able to compete. So when you talk about the Asian century, it's been going on for quite some time. The key there is, can the ideas of consensus which exist within Asia, that you talk things out rather than trying to, throw bombs and bullets and create solutions that way, whether that will be allowed to work. Right now, as I said, the U.S. is struggling with the downgrading of its hegemony. It's still the most powerful country in the world and will remain so for the foreseeable future. For nothing, no other reason, the amount of money it spends on its military. But the idea that it can force other countries in a kind of Hunger Games scenario to pay allegiance and fealty to it, those days are gone. So yes, Asia has risen. It is going to be different. As I was describing earlier, you have large mega trends which are affecting the way that the world is developing. But you also have nations like the United States and to a lesser extent Europe who are clinging to a past that unfortunately has already left.
You talked about new trends and the rise of China. So my next question is, how do you perceive the India's rise? Do you believe that its rise is to contain China or that it will co-opt in Asia in near future?
Well, India is certainly a very ancient civilization, a collection of civilizations. I mean, India didn't really exist until the British kind of manufactured it, putting together all these smaller kingdoms, etc. It certainly has a lot to draw on culturally, but purely on an economic standard, it does not compare to China. If you start looking in China at people between the ages of 6 to 28, the literacy rate is 99.7 or 8%. In India, it would be 40%, and that means That's 40% who have an education above grade school. High school, it starts to drop off precipitously as well. Having a large population, there's this kind of antiquated idea that somehow this will drive prosperity and growth. No, it can actually be the undoing of a country if those people do not have jobs. It can be a driver of instability and chaos. Large groups of people who have no hope, do not have the ability to even help themselves because they lack the education and training necessary to participate in the economy. Those are going to become negative factors in a society, not positive ones. The fact that they need to eat, if they can't eat, there's going to be serious consequences. So at this point, if you look at the infrastructure, the ability of the government to act in a long-term strategic fashion to help its people, India's rise is going to be hampered not by other countries, but simply by its own internal workings.
So let's talk about other middle powers other than India. What do you think that how will the global peer pressure will change the middle powers in future?
Well, the middle powers, really, that's a story which I associate most closely with BRICS and BRICS Plus. You see a long line of countries who want to be part of this new grouping, and you have to ask yourself why. The G7 and G8 at one time were, they were ruled the roost. Basically, they were the fulcrum upon which all economic decisions depended on. Unfortunately, the U.S.-led downturn because of a global financial crisis in 2008 and 9, they obviously weren't up to it. They created the G20. G20 was able to respond at that time, but it has not been able to respond since. In today's crisis, what we saw in India was that India did very well for itself. It got some cases in the United States. It got a factory to produce military jet engines, etc. But unfortunately, it was only able to deliver a lot of watered down speeches and promises that are, there's no fiscal money, there's no fiscal notes to them. It's not clear how they're going to be achieved. So now you have a vacuum that's been created, and these middle powers are, where are they going? Not to the UN anymore, which has become so bogged down and antiquated. You have a P5, the Security Council, which seems to, for no particular reason, clinging to this idea that these powers have the right to make vetoes over decisions that the rest of the world wants to make. So, at this point, they have to, these countries, these middle powers are looking for a forum where their voices can be heard and where they can make a difference. They're no longer content to sit and complain. They now want to take action. And you can see that quite clearly with OPEC, Saudi Arabia, along with OPEC plus Russia, has determined that they want to keep the price of oil stable, which means that if it goes too high, they will increase production. If it goes too low, they will decrease production. This is actually a boon for most entities. The difficulty with business is that you need certainty. I'd rather know what the price of energy is going to be within a very small band than trying to figure out how to deal with wide variances like we've had in the past. But it's also self-protecting. Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, Russia, Venezuela, all the oil-producing countries are tired of being yanked around by these larger powers who are telling them, no, you should just do as we tell you to do. Don't worry about your concerns, worry about ours. Those days are gone. And if this pattern, as I said before, is emulated by other countries who control strategic and vital resources, they will be able to, as I said, start developing their own economies, their own infrastructure, taking care of their own environmental issues. And it'll be a much, much more different world. So yes, I think the rise of the middle powers is already here, and you can see quite clearly that they intend to push forward with their voices, especially as the voices of the developed world start to recede and vacuums are created by their inaction.
Okay, Mr. Tangen, I would like to know, what are your final thoughts on the relevance of Asia and the global order?
Asia right now is leading the world in terms of new thoughts, in terms of connectivity, putting in infrastructure, developing new types of solutions, new groupings. There has to be some concern that America and Europe and other developed countries might try to stir dissension. Obviously, that is the U.S. game plan, whether it's Taiwan or Hong Kong, Tibet or Xinjiang or South China Seas. The U.S. never tires of basically putting using gunboat diplomacy in order to kind of push what it sees as its agenda, holding on to its hegemony. The only thing that can prevent more chaos, as we see right now from the conflict that is raging now, not only in Ukraine, but now in Palestine and Israel, is for countries to work together instead of polarizing, instead of knowingly creating a series of dominoes that's going to come back in a tragedy that's going to affect all people. Already, oil prices are up, fertilizer prices are up. There's concerns about contagion going across Asia as a whole. And China is an important part of it because it's been a leader in this movement, represent a new kind of order, one that does not rely on this bullets and bombs, and that you can somehow solve diplomatic issues with force. So at this point, I do think it's refreshing that we have a new order, but along with change comes danger. And hopefully we can avoid those. The Thucydides trap is always there. China's trying to avoid it. It's not clear what the U.S. intentions are. Leadership has been an issue there. Hopefully, for the entire world, it can be resolved at some time in the future.
Mr. Tangen, thank you so much for the discussion and taking time out for the CSCR.
My pleasure. All the best.
See you some other time. Bye-bye.
All right.